Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's ISPI webinar panel event on the road ahead, designing the future of Middle East economies. My name is Ad Hamazi, an Associate Fellow of Chatham House, and I'm honored to be the moderator for today's session. The panel is anchored around the Med 2021 hybrid conference titled Leveraging Transitions, and it is fair to say that MENA seems to be in perennial transition, if I may say so, be it political, economic, societal, demographic, climate, technological, etc., etc. Though, of course, there are huge variations across countries in a region. I'm sure Isaac will agree that we perhaps shoehorn as a unit of analysis sometimes and understanding. The title of the meeting may be punching over its weight as discourse on sort of building, developing, creating, reconfiguring economic models, diversification, growth, business friendliness, and an independent non-rent seeking, I emphasize, non-rent seeking private sector or rent dependent private sector has been going on for decades. But despite this, sort of in recent years, some countries at least, we can say have seen a genuine, real commitment to push forward, albeit under duress vis-a-vis lower oil prices, and of course, fiscal situations and broader unsustainability issues. And of course, the pandemic has, if you like, accelerated some of these transitions for better or worse, hopefully more the former than the latter, inshallah. And the importance of state capacity has made a big comeback. From Taiwan from Santiago or Chile, Brazil to Beijing, state capacity means business. And it's something that we hope to see more of in MENA in due course. In this single hour, we'll be speaking to leading minds, movers and shakers who will provide some perspectives on my mini shopping list of questions on where we're at, what vision and reform processes look like at the moment, what competitiveness and complementarity look like, and of course, the role of entrepreneurship and financing a sine qua non for the progress and prosperity of this region. I've been mean because I've asked my colleagues on the panel to give very short 3 to 4 minute answers, very difficult. We aim to keep the conversation broad yet dynamic. I've tried to lobby our event organizers for more time, and I think I've negotiated an extra 5 or 10 minutes. So you do what you can. We'll have to do this again over a 1-week retreat, I was telling colleagues just earlier. So jumping right in, and I'll introduce colleagues as and when they make their initial interventions, and it's more of a conversation style, dynamic as we'd like the private sector to be. I'm going to start with Professor Isaac Dewan, who is a professor of economics at Paris Sciences et Lettres. Isaac, if I could start, if you could give us what I describe as intellectual scaffolding, as it were, the framing. I have 2 questions in one. What is a useful typology for thinking about MENA economies on December the 3rd, 2021? And what are the 3 central questions in the region, if we can speak more broadly, one needs to consider when thinking about reform processes and the success of reforms and visions, design, implementation? Isaac, over to you.
Well, thank you, Adil. I'm really honored to be part of such a wonderful panel. And thank you for the strong introduction. I think you really lay out the basis of this brave new word, with more technology, climate change, lower oil revenues, tighter fiscal space, the need to build resilience and really find better ways to integrate globally. So you've asked me to lay out a very broad, I would say, political economy picture of the 3 challenges ahead. I think really we need to differentiate between 2 types of countries in the region to focus on this question. Those aiming to build competitive politics and those trying to build development states, and dynamics are different in both. The first group includes Tunisia, Sudan, Lebanon, perhaps Iraq. These are countries betting that on a social contract based on openness, on political competition, hoping that this will absorb shocks and will support the development of a competitive and inclusive private sector based on competition, on innovation. And these countries face really 3 challenges, mostly in the institutional realm. First, how to consolidate governance so that political competition does not weaken the state capacity to be decisive and take decisions. Tough challenge. Second, to control corruption. And third, really to increase social trust in ways that fosters cooperation between the various parts of society, avoiding conflict, avoiding polarization. So that's the first group. The second group focuses really on the states delivering forceful industrial policy and guiding closely the development process. It's a different type of political economy. This, of course, includes the GCC states, but also Morocco. And we could say that Algeria and Egypt are also trying, although still early on in their building up of an industrial policy. In these countries, really the first challenge is to create the conditions for a patient, non-myopic, long-term strategy, the political and social conditions for that. The second challenge, I would say, is more operational, is really how to improve the state capacity to deliver such a program, to pick winners and to avoid white elephants. And here, really, the lessons from East Asia's miracle is for the state to be embedded in society, not too close, but not too far, so that it can take the right decisions. And the third challenge, I would say, is perhaps the most important one, is how to foster the creation of a productive sector, private sector, as you said, that is not rentier, but that is productive.
It's like a private sector.
A private sector, exactly. If I may, I would add the last word on the global environment. In the past, the region was very integrated in global trade through oil and oil only, and regionally through labor movement and some public sector capital movement. There is clearly now a need to shift towards more diversified export patterns, less labor mobility, and more trade in skilled services, which is made possible by technology, and much more mobile private capital. We hear about that. And also, of course, more efforts and cooperation on the climate. And so much more than before, the regional cooperation will be necessary. Take the example of trade in services. If this is unleashed, language and culture will be at the heart of value added. And right now, we have 5% of the global population. As we all know, only 1% in internet content. But to conclude, I'd say to foster regional cooperation, there is an acute need to figure out how these two different political economies can coexist productively and peacefully.
Thank you so much, Ishaq, for sort of laying this macro political economy picture within the region and beyond. And the point on exogenous factors impacting development, I think something we may come to shortly. We now fly from Paris to Riyadh. I don't know whether we're taking Air France or Saudia, but we're now going to Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Awaish, who's the Assistant Secretary General of the GCC, dear friend who I had the pleasure of seeing just a few weeks ago in Saudi. At GCC level, Abdulaziz, we are seeing, there's a lot of discourse and discussion, media hype about competition within the GCC, this region that almost carries the region. We've heard about regional rentierism, etc. Are we seeing healthy or unhealthy competition between the various vision programs? And if you could just say a little bit about what the low-hanging fruits for complementarity and cooperation are going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Adel. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I always admire your energy and your creativity every time there is a new subject. So really great. I admire what you're doing. I think it's a good question, but there is a lot of hype about it. I don't think we have to worry about competition. Usually you worry about competition at later stages of development, not at this stage now where we have a lot of slack, in fact, that can be filled easily with different companies. I recall when we were drafting the second economic agreement between member states, some participants, especially from countries with lower level of GDP, raised this concern, and they were afraid they would not be able to compete with the more resourceful countries. And they suggested unifying incentives and basically the business climate. But it was agreed not to do that and to allow competition. My view is that we actually need to enhance competition. We need not worry about it as long as it is healthy. And the reason is that I would say there are at least two reasons. One is that we still have stubborn vestiges of monopolistic behavior in GCC economies that need to be broken or ended. And the only way to do it is by increasing competition, not by limiting competition. There is some resistance, of course. I joined the GCC more than 20 years ago, and we started work on in fact, incentivizing competition, increasing competition, and we still haven't succeeded in doing that, either within member states or between member states. So I think we have a long way to go before we have perfect competition or good competition, let alone unhealthy competition. I think so. Also, fighting predatory practices will contribute to competition. I mentioned monopolistic behavior, but also dumping. There is, in fact, dumping between member states. I think whenever there is a gap in legislation, private companies will try to utilize, will try to take advantage of it. And so the customs union, for example, created many opportunities for predatory practices. And this is something the GCC works on all the time. I mean, we had a regime of free trade area in the first 20 years of the GCC history. And that, while it created opportunities, it's also created new obstacles. I think we're seeing that with the customs union as well. At the beginning, it opened great opportunities, but then, as I said, some private companies use some gaps in the system to engage in unhealthy predatory practices, and that's, I think, what is probably you're referring to in the unhealthy competition. I think all GCC member states have ambitious vision programs, and they're almost all focused on diversification. So there is lots of room, no fear for unhealthy competition. Saudi Arabia, for example, recently announced a national investment strategy to generate or attract $7 trillion worth of investment by 2030. About 500 billion of that 7 trillion is expected to come from outside Saudi Arabia. And by 2030, so the 500 billion, meaning during the coming 9 years, and by 2030, it hopes that the annual FDI flows will reach about 100 billion. And we expect that much of that will come from GCC states, so that's actually encouraged, not discouraged. And I think there are several, if I may go to the next question, which is what are the low-lying fruits. I think there are several priority areas for the different visions of GCC member states. And I would mention 5 that has been identified in almost every vision program for the 6 GCC countries. And one of them is tourism. And in some cities, yes, I think it's fairly advanced, but I think in many places, especially Saudi Arabia, which only recently opened its doors for foreign tourism, there's a lot of room for physical investment by all investors, including other GCC investors. The next area is basic infrastructure: roads, ports, metros, industrial parks. And the third is education. As you probably know, tens of thousands of students from the GCC countries go abroad for training, for advanced training. And I think many of those could be receiving their education within GCC countries if there were enough institutions to accommodate them. Yes. And fourth, climate change. All the GCC member states have announced that they are committed to climate change and also to zero-sum.
Do they believe those targets, Abdulaziz?
Sorry?
Do they believe those targets?
No, these are in the future. I mean, they're...
No, I understand 2050, 2060. But I'm asking you rhetorically, do they believe those targets? But sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, let me complete and then get back to this question. I think climate change also provides great opportunities for investment and renewables, the development of renewables. Although almost all the GCC countries have rich resources of conventional energy, they're all committed and engaged in developing renewables. So in these 5 areas, I think if I were an investor, I would focus on these 5 areas because I think there is good economics behind them, but also there is strong government commitment to investment in those areas. So I think those would be probably, as the usual language, the low-hanging fruits.
Thank you.
Sorry, and your question was, sorry?
No, I was asking rhetorically about the targets, but we can come back to them. Thank you so much for laying these sort of areas for cooperation and some of the challenges around predatory and predatory practices, etc. And I'm sure the point on crowding out the private sector is something that comes up a lot in sort of developmental drives. We don't take a plane now. We'll take a Land Cruiser and drive through the Abu Samra crossing to Doha, where we go to our friend Sheikh Al-Anud Al-Thani, who's the Deputy CEO of the Qatar Financial Center. And Al-Anud, I just want to ask you, as somebody who's leading an onshore financial and business center in the region, for you, what does competitiveness look like to you? What are the ingredients or characteristics of competitiveness? And how does the QFC, where you're sitting right now, fit into the economic diversification and upgrading set out in Qatar's own Vision 2030, National Vision 2030?
Well, firstly, assalamu alaikum for everyone who's joining us today. I'm delighted and honored to be amongst such distinguished panelists. And thank you, Adel, for organizing and for having me as well. I mean, for Qatar and QFC, competitiveness has several dimensions. First, hydrocarbons will continue to be a major source of revenue and economic growth in Qatar for the foreseeable future. And as more countries expand production of natural gas, shale oil, and alternative energy, Qatar needs to maintain its competitive advantage in energy production. And this was and has also, we need to maintain our competitive advantage, but also in the transitioning to cleaner and renewable sources. And this was a main driver behind Qatar's petroleum's recent rebranding as Qatar Energy. Secondly, Qatar is in the process of developing competitive industries that will form the foundation of an economically diversified and sustainable post-hydrocarbon economy. And these include industries that are helping Qatar to become more self-sufficient, including manufacturing, companies and agricultural firms, as just a few examples. And thirdly, Qatar is working to strengthen opportunities for foreign direct investment and become a destination of choice for global companies interested in doing business in the region. And this is where QFC plays a role. We have established a world-class legal, regulatory, tax, and business environment via a platform where local and international firms can establish or expand their commercial presence. And being based in Qatar offers many competitive advantages: an open business environment for international investors grounded on a resilient, fast-growing economy and a stable dollar-pegged economy, a legal framework that has integrated policies that align commercial and industrial activities with the National Vision 2030, which is a blueprint for the country's development, a world-class education and research facilities, including campuses of leading global universities operating under the umbrella of Qatar Foundation. We have a professional, well-regulated business environment with an increasing number of well-serviced access points for foreign companies, including the QFC as one of those, and an exceptional infrastructure and logistics, including the region's first 5G mobile network and the second largest air freight carrier in the world, Qatar Airways. And we offer a safe and stable environment to live and raise a family with excellent schools, quality, affordable healthcare, and a friendly and hospitable society. But we at QFC and Qatar as a whole have had the success that we have in large part because we recognize that competitiveness for a special economic zone or for a small country like ours is about more than just tax breaks and economic incentives. Incentives are an attractive tax environment. Having it is important without question, but international investors have options, and there are more than 5,000 special economic zones similar to ours operating globally in well over 100 countries. So competing in this ocean solely on tax breaks and economic incentives is inevitably a race to the bottom. So competition on those grounds is also likely to fail to support a country's national development objectives, since it is not likely to generate the broad economic prosperity that policymakers seek. So not only that, but it also fails to address investors' needs as well. Global investors are ultimately looking for a good return on their investment. Incentives are a part of that, yes, but numerous other factors are just as important, from an attractive legal and regulatory environment to political stability, to access to infrastructure and talent. And competing only in terms of incentives addresses none of these needs. So competitiveness for us as QFC and for Qatar means delivering on all of these fronts. Competitiveness means putting in place the necessary institutions and policies to create a uniquely compelling value proposition and ultimately an economy that is productive and prosperous and sustainable in the long term.
Thank you so much, Al-Anud. Where do I sign up? It sounds too good. But no, absolutely. I think the I word I think was particularly interesting and important, not only institutions, but incentives. And no pun on the region of monarchies, but capital is coward and cash is king, right? So yeah, it'll be very interesting to hear more. And I'll come back to the knowledge economy point in a bit. We now go back to Saudi Arabia, to Ibrahim Al-Mawjal, who's the CEO of the Saudi Industrial Development Fund, described as, I've got it here, the primary financial enabler for Saudi industrial transformation, been around since the mid-70s, I believe, 74. And I just want to ask you, Ibrahim, how do we appraise Saudi Arabia's industrial efforts 5 years on since, the big program you've heard about in the region, the largest economy, Vision 2013, actually in 2013, we're not far away, by the way. 8-9 years, it's gonna come around very quickly. So could you tell us a little bit about how the industrialization efforts look like from your side? And to speak to that point, what type of model is Saudi Arabia going for in terms of developing, and how will it achieve it?
And I only have 3 minutes.
3 minutes to tell us about the most important question in the region.
I understand. It's been a privilege. It is a privilege to be among you here, and thanks for having me. Thanks for the question. I'll try to summarize it in 3 areas. First, what's our objective? What's the basis for it? And what we've achieved so far. So what's the objective? Is to change the kingdom to become an industrial powerhouse and a global logistical hub. How are we going to achieve it? There is a lot of strategies being built, but I'll highlight 3 elements. Leverage existing industrial capacity in terms of production capacity and skilled labor. Leverage investment and purchasing power and the kingdom's location. So in existing capacity, the kingdom has been leading, whether it's energy in the 50s or petrochemical in the 70s and 80s or food processing in the 80s and 90s. And we have a lot of history into that. Case in point, SIDF being built from 1974. To build upon that, what's the pitch that we have? We want to leverage our ability to invest and our strong purchasing power, whether as an economy or as a government, and leverage our location to become a regional exporter. What have we achieved so far on using the mechanisms I mentioned? I'll also highlight the changes in 3 factors: financing, regulation, and direction. Beginning with direction, the fact that we have one direction helped align the government. Having a big capacity as we have in Saudi overburdens the investor, the player in this society. But now having clear vision ensures that everyone knows their role and they are complementing each other, not competing or detracting. On regulation, I will highlight a couple of changes so far. The regulation on government purchasing, where we are requiring local content in government purchasing. Case in point, in the medical sector, we grew from 20% to 35 or 36% during the 5 years of the vision.
Sorry, Ibrahim, was that during the pandemic mostly? Was that pandemic driven?
No, this is local capacity that was built during the vision years. Okay. And I'll highlight it, I'll make it simpler through our area in financing. So in financing, we expanded the fund. The SIDF grew from pre-vision of a capital of 40 billion riyal, $11 billion, to now an approved capital of 105 billion riyal, $28 billion. We expanded the project offering the sectors to include logistics, mining, and energy. We created a new Exim Bank, and to highlight the speed of change in Saudi, before even the Exim Bank started, I'm the vice chairman there, we approved 5 billion riyals of loans, and actually we approved 6 billion and deployed 4 billion. This is before the NT was even established. So how can I showcase the change? A lot of talk. I'll use this idea. Since the vision was launched in May 2016 till today, we approved loans of 69 billion riyals. This is equivalent to what we did from 1974 till 2008. So what we've done over the 5 years in the vision is equivalent to what we've done in the first 34 years of SIDF. Despite oil, now it's 80 or 70, despite oil averaging around 40 during the 5 years since the vision, this highlights the commitment of the government. Thank you, and I hope I answered.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I think I think in summary, it's the old quote, right? There are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. I think is the big one for framing SIDF progress. We'll now again get back in the car and we'll drive up to Neom, stop off in Neom through Aqaba up to Amman, and we go last but not least to Dina Showman, who is the co-founder of Verity. Dina, you've developed a successful tech business. I for one am super interested. So Verity is the Middle East family banking app, as it's described, if I'm describing it correctly. And you also come from a banking background. So from a sort of entrepreneurship perspective, we often say that, tijara and entrepreneurship, we suffer from cultural amnesia in the region when it comes to this DNA that was in our blood from Hadramaut, East Timor and beyond, right? So could you sort of say a little bit about how, what is holding back entrepreneurship and small businesses more generally, right? We talk about firm level dynamics or growth. And if you could sort of talk about or speak to the top ingredients and reforms needed to unleash and propel entrepreneurship and MSE or SME growth.
Sure, thank you, Adil. Yeah, Verity is MENA's family banking and financial literacy app. We help parents teach kids the value of money through different features in the app, how to save, give, and spend wisely through our prepaid card and earn money through chores. Just to give you a bit of background, so although the ecosystem is considered more nascent in the region when you compare it to the Western world, and we still have a bit of a way to go, the growth we have been seeing recently has been quite impressive. And from a funding perspective, just this year, we're seeing large amounts of money ready to be invested in the region. And to date, just for the first half, there has been a record $1.2 billion in funding, which is a 12% increase from all of 2020. I know that 2020 has been a tough year, but that's still quite impressive for just half of the year. And it's a really great time for early startups and early stage startups to be raising money. But I think startups that are more in the pre-seed stage, pre-product, pre-launch, where the support for funding is mostly needed, that's one area that is challenging, as well as those that are at much, much later stages, like those that are almost before acquisition or exits. And that's where the serious funding is needed in the region. For small businesses or SMEs, as we call them in the banking world, I think banks today still haven't been able to break away beyond the typical ways of assessing businesses. They usually look at credit histories, and for many of these companies, they don't have a credit history that they can rely on. And then, instead of looking at the future, they're looking at the past instead of the potential of these companies. Another thing I would say is better access to markets. So if you think about it, the MENA population is approximately about 465 million by the end of 2020. And the US alone, a country that can conduct business between each other in a very easy way, is 330 million. So we're even over that. Better relations between the countries and making it easier for companies to expand and operate in different countries and to be able to access international markets and have the ability to export to them is really key. There are other challenges as well, I would say. I think because also it's a nascent ecosystem, we don't have as much startup experience in the region still. We have a lot of graduates from the success stories that we have all heard about, but yet there's not enough for them to really populate other startups, and many of them go on and they start their own startups themselves. In addition to like highly technical expertise, which is really difficult and super expensive to find in the region, which then leads us to the fact that lots of startups would like to hire more foreign talent to be able to cover these skills, and it's not that easy in a lot of the countries today. So in terms of the reforms and the potential things that policymakers can do, I think one of the biggest things, and this is why I've been working in financial literacy for almost 7 years now, is personal financial literacy. There's been a lot of focus on entrepreneurship with lots of educational programs and building the ecosystem with accelerators, funds, and VCs. But we cannot forget personal financial literacy. If you want to open a company and be expected to manage its finances, how can you do that if you don't know how to manage your own finances? So I'm actually very happy to see that a lot of governments across the region has now started focusing on this, including Jordan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, among many others. But we need to make sure that also the efforts are not just tick the box kind of exercise, but that it's really comprehensive and addresses it early on, especially with children. The other thing I wanted to also mention is, many people start saying like you need to change the regulations and issue new ones and whatnot, but sometimes it's actually the interpretation of these regulations. The other day I had the honor of meeting with His Majesty King Hussein with a number of startups here in Jordan to discuss how can we better support the startup ecosystem of Jordanian founders here and across the region and around the world. And it was really interesting, and it's true to say that the way one interprets the law is really key. So if you actually look at it from these, I would say 4 points or 4 types of lenses, and if it's not interpreted through them in that way, or it does not support them, then it's a wrong interpretation of the law. The first is it attracting investments into the country? The second is it helping the country grow the economy? Is it creating jobs? And is it helping increase exports? And if the way that it's interpreted doesn't support these, then we're actually interpreting it the wrong way. We also need to make sure that the regulations and everything is attractive for investors, and also in foreign investors. It's very common that when you have foreign investors investing in a startup, they really are more comfortable when they're based somewhere that they're familiar with, offshore and whatnot. So, and having those regulations really clear and understandable by investors is key. And there's so many more things that I don't know if I'm running out of time that I could mention.
We're going to do a 1-week retreat.
Yes.
And a white paper to all of the governments.
But if I can just two last points really quickly, I'm sorry, but because from the fintech perspective, the developing open banking regulations and policies, that's also really key, with more startup friendly sandboxes like so many places are doing, and also involvements of central banks, IP and copyright protections, and women-focused programs and support, because the women founders also need a lot of encouragement and support for their businesses to grow. In 2018, and this is I think the most recent thing I could find, is about only 11% of funding was for women-founded startups in MENA, and that's really low. So more programs to promote women entrepreneurship would be also great. Thank you. Sorry for going over time.
No. So we're wonderful to get that sort of micro and meso level perspective. And I think what's really important, not only the entrepreneurship dimension when it comes to financial literacy, but with this drive of sort of cash transfer driven social protection, you have to know where you're going to put your money, right? If you're talking about a family of 3 or 4 and your kids and so on and so forth. I'd like now to go back to Paris and go back to Ishaq, and he sort of touched on some of these topics already. But for decision makers in and across MENA countries facing, you referred to that first typology or that first grouping, those facing growing political and social contestation, of course, thinking about macroeconomic instability, mass or underemployment, impending debt crises. What remains in the toolkit for these non-GCC countries? You also mentioned Morocco in that group, and Algeria, Egypt in this sort of semi-precarious position. Those other countries, in a really difficult situation, what remains in the toolkit for them?
Well, they are certainly in a difficult position, and in a way, it's not a sprint for them. It's a marathon. How to grow out of the problems. The way I laid it out before is that I think the main constraint there are really political. The problems have been accumulating over time because governments have not been able to be decisive enough. The example of Lebanon is obvious. I mean, we saw this crisis coming for years. The example in Tunisia is quite clear. Problems have accumulated over time. There was inability to rein in the demands for higher wages, more public servants, and debts have been growing over time, and the solutions are not very difficult, but it's the political constraints that have been tough. So I think for these countries, it's really political progress and institutional progress that's crucial. The contrast with the picture from Saudi Arabia and from the other GCC countries, even from Jordan, which is not very difficult, from Morocco, is striking. These are governments that are able to think long term and to build their potential and to be very decisive. I mean, the industrial policy followed by Saudi Arabia is unique. If anything, one wants to see a little bit more, if I may say, a little bit less ambitions, perhaps a bit more realism in the speed in which things are unfolding. You know, one may wonder, are we being careful enough to build internal capacity to go that fast?
Ibrahim disagrees with you, Isaac.
Okay, but I mean, I think it's a very different kind of question. In the first group, no decisions. In the second group, the risk of having too many decisions too fast. It's an extremely different environment. I would like to put the question on the table for Saudi Arabia in particular, which has a large population, a lot of educated youth coming to the market. You know, to what extent is or should the goal be really to create jobs, good jobs, productive jobs that can pay high salaries with good enough education and skill in the population to take these jobs, as opposed to maximize GDP and production and value added at home, which sometimes contradicts actually this job because it would require a lot more importation of labor. And to what extent you know, are you sensitive in the kingdom to that tension?
No, thank you. I was going to put a labor question to Ibrahim so we can come back to that. Industry, we hope, will be labor intensive, not only for non-nationals, but of course, skilled nationals too. And on the point on debt, Isaac, there's a Hemingway novel, that a quote that came up the other day, right? So the sun also always rises or also rises. And one gentleman asked another gentleman, he says, how did you go bankrupt? And he said, 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly. And that's a situation that we hope we don't find ourselves in too many of the countries in the region. I'd like to go back to Riyadh and Abdulaziz. Abdulaziz, of course, I know you have a very wide mandate, but you also look at GCC's relationships with the rest of the world. Could you sort of speak to some of the exogenous factors impacting MENA economies going forward? And what could propel or even hinder economic growth, plans, growth, competitiveness, etc.?
Yes, and I like the question that also Ishaq put forward about the sort of internal challenges, but you're asking about the exogenous factors. And I would say there are probably 4. And the most immediate one, whether is how successful we are going to be in handling the pandemic and its economic aftermath. As we can follow the news, I mean, as we were trying to get out of the Delta variant, we have a new variant, and it's just casting doubts about the global recovery. So that's for us is the number 1 exogenous factor that I think will affect, especially the Gulf region, but other regions as well. Meaning, if we fail to address the pandemic adequately, then that will slow the global recovery, will reduce demand for oil, and so on and so forth. And the next exogenous factor to worry about is instability. In particular, failure, I think, to persuade Iran to live within its national borders and according to international norms. If the international community fails to do that, then that's a recipe for continued instability. And I think that puts a damper on the desire to invest in the region, and will make our plans, I think, more difficult to implement. And the third is terrorism. And I think we see that the failure in Afghanistan so far, while the United States and NATO withdrew precipitously, I would say, created a space, an ungoverned space for Daesh and maybe other groups in the future. So I think that's another exogenous factor that we worry about. And we're working around the clock in the GCC collectively and also at the national level to try to come up with ways to contain the potential for growth of terrorism in Afghanistan. So far, it's worrying, but we hope to deal with that. The fourth exogenous factor I think we need to watch is the geopolitical competition between China and the US, but also Russia, I would say. I think if we're not able to manage that competition, it could cast some doubts about the ability to move forward in our ambitious visions in the GCC and maybe in other countries as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. The sort of the discussion around the Huaweiization of the GCC and MENA is one which makes DC nervous, and it's a discussion I think that we will be sort of covering for a very long time to come. I'd now like to go back to Al Anud in Doha, and Al Anud, if you could sort of talk or speak to the idea around this knowledge economy term, and what the transition looks like. I'm sometimes skeptical about who defines it and what does it mean really. But if you could say a little bit about what are we hearing about in Qatar on this term, the GCC, and what is being done to get there, and what is missing most importantly.
As you said, Adel, I mean, the phrase knowledge economy has become popular, but it is also often misunderstood. When we talk about creating a knowledge economy, we are not simply talking about attracting a certain industry or the production of particular goods or services. Those can be hallmarks. What a knowledge economy is and what countries in the GCC are working toward is an economy that has innovation at its core, an economy that is adaptive and resilient and that supports the economic potential of all of its citizens. And this is the objective, not just because the phrase is popular today, but also because it is a necessity, as GCC countries are working to diversify their economies away from diminishing revenues from oil and gas. Now, global challenges also make it obvious that we all must diversify our economies. That is well known. But the conventional industrialization approach to diversification no longer works as a guarantee for economic growth. Technology is transforming all of our economies and has disrupted essentially every industry. And the pace of that innovation is only accelerating. So in this context, the only economies that can succeed are those that are not only able to innovate, but that do so as a matter of course. So developing a knowledge economy isn't about attracting a particular tech industry or positioning your economy in the supply chain of a particular good. It's about creating an economy capable of continuous adaptation. And this is, of course, a massive task. Even the most advanced economies have a difficulty delivering this for all of their citizens. Now, the region already boasts some of the best infrastructure globally. Our logistics capacity is world-class. GCC countries are implementing major regulatory reforms. GCC countries are investing heavily in information and communications technologies, which is the key component of knowledge economies. They are also investing in skills development and improving their business environments, also important, but which remain lacking. Now, all of these ingredients are essential for a knowledge economy. Of course, the pace also varies from country to country, and much work remains to be done. But across the region, you see an increasingly dynamic business environment, with private sector activity and investment steadily on the rise due to the recognition that the region offers a lot of opportunity. Now, an area that will remain crucial to this effort, though, is education. A knowledge economy also requires a highly educated workforce. And historically, our region has lagged in this respect. Now, across the region, countries all recognize this, and we have made extensive efforts. In Qatar, for example, we have invested heavily. In Education City in Doha, we host full campuses of 9 leading global universities. Through the Educated Child Initiative, Qatar is working to enroll in school 10 million children in the region and globally who do not have access to primary education. But we still have some distance to go, and particularly in higher education. In the region, our number of PhDs and patents remain low compared to advanced economies, and all countries struggle to establish knowledge economies. But case after case study make clear that it is a key ingredient. Now, to get where we need to be, we will all need to redouble our efforts. In Qatar again, for example, we are working aggressively, including through the Qatar Research Development and Innovation Council, which was created recently to coordinate and support initiatives to advance R&D and innovation across the economy. That said, again, more needs to be done. While Qatar has become adept at producing knowledge and promoting learning, the next step is ensuring that the knowledge produced is being effectively applied and that it is providing value to the country and contributing to its economic development. Now, our economic future will depend on our ability to develop economies that are resilient and adaptive, and our role at Qatar Financial Center is to play a part by attracting the sorts of companies and investments that will support this development. But no strategy will be successful without a strong educational system at its foundation. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Al-Hanoud, for that overview. What I take from that in terms of a summary is it's important to invest in the content of the curriculum as well as the color scheme of the campuses. And I know you were previously at Silatech, and I know a little bit about that sort of education/economy nexus work that you were doing under those under that banner. I'd now like to go back to Ibrahim, and it's anchored around Isaacs' question on labor. For me, this is the conundrum of conundrums in the GCC, the labor market issue. And I was hoping you could say a little bit about Saudi or GCC more generally in terms of, how do you view labor market challenges and local content efforts in terms of hindering competitiveness and or productivity? And of course, here we could speak to services or industry. And if you could tell us why or why not.
So earlier, I actually agreed with the speed that we are going, and I was just,
okay.
I didn't agree with the challenge of the speed. I'm saying I agree we're running very fast. And while you're running very fast, mistakes can happen. But I think we always compare to an ideal that doesn't exist. The question is, do you run fast and be willing to make mistakes and correct course, or do you do it as you did before? I would much rather do what we're doing now, run full potential, make mistakes, be comfortable with the mistakes, change them and continue, than be stuck in a study after a study after a study. We all lived through this, and we don't think it should continue. But back to the question on labor, I'll divide it into two. Labor challenge in general, but then I'll focus on manufacturing, be it my area of expertise. Labor market in general, I can't agree more with Sheikh Al-Hanoud. It is the main challenge, and developing talent is the most important thing. Our most limited resource in the GCC is our people. We don't have that many, and if we want to continue with the GDP levels that we have for Saudi to continue as a G20 country, we need the value add of each person to be high. You cannot sustain that with cheap labor. So long term, the solution is in development and investment in education. The most recent Vision program, which is uniquely chaired by His Royal Highness Crown Prince Mohammed, is the human resource program for Saudi Arabia. Now, solution of it in the short term, in Saudi, we adopted the services industry, so we have tourism and created jobs, especially in remote areas across the kingdom. There isn't an easy way to do it. Tourism really helped open a lot of doors there. Expanding the service sector is important. Allow me now to go into manufacturing. I think for manufacturing, this idea of competing with cheap labor is misguided. We cannot. Even if you import it, you still will be more expensive than the countries that export it. But even if you can import, what's the point of importing cheap labor and creating low value add industries? I think I'll take 3 global trends that create a unique opportunity for the GCC. Automation is taking over cheap labor, customization taking over from scale, and resilience to efficiency. So when you think of that, what does that mean? Customization and automation in the economic equation put more focus on the capital aspect than labor, which is a strength for the GCC. Resilience versus efficiency tells you that people are redesigning their supply chain, which opens an opportunity now. Where people rethink where they get their supply chain from, there is an opportunity where people are revisiting their current plans. In the GCC, we don't have social pressure of automation. Most of the low-skilled labor is short-term low-skilled labor. If I change it with lower jobs, lower number of jobs, higher value add, I can increase the Saudi jobs that I create. So the whole pitch is that as scale loses to customization and cheap labor to automation, we have an opportunity to create a competitive manufacturing sector in the kingdom. We've seen it with the large petrochemicals. We are seeing it now with pharmaceuticals and food processing. Thank you.
Abdul Aziz had a 2-finger of sorts. Thank you so much, Ibrahim.
Yes. I just want to follow up on what Dr. Ibrahim said. I think it's extremely important. Saudi Arabia has double-digit unemployment and has had double-digit for a long time. despite the fact that it has millions of foreign workers. So there's a mismatch between the skills that are available with Saudi job seekers and the jobs that are available. And I think that accounts for this paradox in a way. And I have taught in a number of GCC universities and their counterparts and also in New York and New Jersey. I have found our students to be incredibly smart. I taught in Qatar, for example. I was really impressed by the quality of the students. And then they go, as Dr. Ibrahim has done, go to the top universities around the world and come back with even greater skills. And we're lucky that Dr. Ibrahim found the right place, and he's working in a place where he was prepared for. But I think for many of the new graduates, especially in the smaller GCC countries, there's a lot of competition from government jobs, for example. And so what they were trained for is not always utilized. And so we have almost zero unemployment in most of the GCC countries. But in fact, there is a mismatch between the skills that those nationals have and the jobs that they're creating. And one solution Dr. Ibrahim mentioned, which is automation. We need to raise the level of production, the processes of production, so that it doesn't rely on cheap labor. And we see that that's the common factor, actually. If you go to any processing, to any industrial process in the GCC, but especially in the services, you see that they're highly they're labor intensive in an environment that doesn't really need to do that. And then the jobs, the wages that are paid for skilled labor are not enough to attract nationals. And it is a dilemma, and I think that all the GCC countries are trying to address it. What we see now, and being at the GCC, we received hundreds of applicants, people looking for work. And so we have, I think, maybe thousands, in fact, of CVs that are available at any given time, every time we have a job open. And even though these jobs are not in industry, but they find a lot of people want to get them. I think what has changed recently, and I see that in Prince Mohammed bin Salman's announcements, is that we are now at a place where we can address this problem. And so we talk about good jobs and bad jobs. We talk about higher level knowledge content. This is something we haven't seen before. I started working with the Saudi government to develop an employment agents strategy maybe 20 years ago. And the kind of discussion we had at the time with ministers and deputies is different from the discussion we're having today. Today, I think there is recognition for this problem, and there is a need to address it. I don't know what the best solution for it, because without imposing some regulatory frameworks to make it possible to absorb the nationals, but also to absorb them in the right jobs, not in government jobs or in do-nothing jobs. Thank you.
Issa, can very brief two-finger, because I want to get to Dina, please.
Yeah, no, very quickly. I mean, the issue of the regional market, the 300 million, and back to automation, customization, resilience. The region would be much more resilient to Iran shock, to terrorism shock, if there was also investment, not only in automation in the GCC, but in this whole idea of using capital and Arab labor. There are lots of opportunities in terms of relocation of industry towards places closer to Europe. There is the Arab market, which because of customization needs to produce in the Arab region. And so, I wish we would reopen the topic of not just investing in each one's country, but in really taking advantage and opening up this market that really can raise all ships if it was invested in.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, Isaac. Just to go back to Amman and to Dina, there are a lot of sort of discussions. We heard about the typology at the beginning. Sort of, it seems like a tale of two cities or tale of two types of country, right? When it comes to MENA, haves and have-nots, jabs and jab-nots, but also banked and unbanked. I know you have a banking background. That's the genesis of Dina's career trajectory, and more, if I may say so. But I'll let you speak to that. Could you say a little bit about how do you see the future of banking? I know that's a big topic, but what are the sort of characteristics of the future of banking in the region from Rabat to Muscat in the coming years? In a few minutes, of course.
Sure, I'll try to stick to the few minutes, but that is a big question. And I think many of us would love to know what the actual future of banking will be in many years. So as you know, digital transformation has been accelerated because of COVID. You're seeing more digital banks and digital services coming on board. But the fact remains that it's still a highly regulated sector, which is also very costly to continue to remain in compliance with. But we've also seen open banking as well as fintechs coming up, and banks also trying to find different ways to offer services to its customers, especially because there's a challenge to address customer needs, such as Gen Z today, and for them to create the best experience. And that's also where the fintechs come in, right? So there's many programs that are coming up to help fintechs collaborate with banks, including the sandboxes and the central banks. But the relationship between the two yet is to be seen how it plays out. So some banks we've seen have preferred to try to do everything themselves with minimal interaction or partnerships with fintechs. Some are a bit more progressive and open, and they understand and can see that fintechs that are focused and very skilled in the specific things that they do can add a big value to the banks and their business. And because of the acceleration of digital transformation, fintechs are making the services of banking more available to the unbanked, like you said. And although this helps us and being able to provide the unbanked with tools, but the key is also not to just give them to tools, but to teach them how to use them and for them, again, back to financial literacy. They both go hand in hand. So without the education, it could be pointless and maybe even irresponsible. So financial literacy is a big factor for the economic growth. It's essential life skill that everyone should have. 2 out of 3 adults in the world are financially illiterate. By starting financial literacy early and learning it, it improves financial capability, where people can start using the knowledge and tools to become more capable of earning their own money, investing, growing their money. And of course, you see today, the world's getting more and more difficult, more and more expensive. So that is really key. And when you start with children, you can actually start teaching them from as young as 4 or 5 years old. Research has shown they can start learning very basic concepts. And in fact, by the age of 7, they form their financial attitudes and behaviors. Not to say that it's too late for all of us, but you can still start and change that. But why not start early on? So soon also, this is key because MENA has a young population, and in years you'll see the intergenerational transfer of wealth. So if you don't have financial literacy, that could be a big problem in terms of managing that money and doing good with it. So it's important to build money management skills early on so that they can better position people to minimize debt and learn how to grow their money.
Thank you so much.
I hope that was fast enough.
It was very fast. You've managed breadth and depth, which is a skill on of its own right, and maybe that's something we could teach along with financial and digital literacy in the region. Sorry. Sadly, it's a luxury to have this level of expertise and brain capital, or I forgot the term, Isaac, what do the Norwegians call it? Collective brain power or something along those lines. But I hope we can do this again. But just before we sort of slowly wrap up, just one question, and it's a sort of a more fun question. We'll go in the same order. So starting with Isaac, you've got a few million spare in the back pocket, right? You're a foreign investor. Which country and which sector would you put your money in? And you cannot say the country that you are from. Isaac, over to you.
Tough one. I don't know. I'd invest in tourism in Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
Simply because I'd love to visit the country.
Very good. Very good. Very good. Very good. Thank you. Abdulaziz, over to you.
Yes, I would say invest in all GCC countries.
No,
Of course.
you can't. No. Saudis.
Except Saudi Arabia, since it's half already picked it. But I would say that logistics, transportation, tourism, but I would agree with tourism and renewable energies. I think will be my pick.
Absolutely. Thank you. Al-Anud.
Well, as they say, women are always right. So I'm going to go along with Qatar. But I would go with green technologies, tourism, property tech, anything related to technologies. Saudi has great exposure, so I would definitely look into that.
Absolutely. And Ibrahim.
I'll invest in youth. So whether it's tech, education, and other, I think that's what I'll invest in.
And if you had to pick a specific country, which one would it be?
GCC minus Saudi. If I have to not to include Saudi.
Wow.
We need scale. I don't think we should think. I don't think we should think countries now. With these things, you need to think region. So whether it's from Jordan to Yemen to UAE to Qatar, we need the scale. And unless we think regionally, I don't think we can succeed.
Absolutely. And actually, as we go over to Jordan, I was doing some work there a few years ago, and there was this idea that Jordan could serve as the back office IT hub for a lot of the reconstruction in the region, which is an idea that's still on the cards. Before going to Dina for the last word, Isaac wanted to come back in.
I was simply uploading your regional comment.
Excellent. Dina, last word to you.
Sure, I agree with the regional thing, and it's, I would, because I guess I'm biased in fintech, I would say fintech, and I would probably choose, although so many places are great opportunities, but I'll probably choose Egypt because they're just recently opening up a bit more, and so I'd find like that a great opportunity for a big impact as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I can't thank colleagues enough for wonderful, broad, deep, wide-reaching insights from San Francisco to Shanghai via MENA and a few countries on the way. I very much look forward to doing this again. I won't ask you about your level of optimism for some of the vision programs. We'll just have to do this again and do a scorecard update very soon. I very much look forward to seeing you all in person very soon, beyond hybrid, but technology is still doing wonders. So alhamdulillah for that. And to sort of finalize it, just to say, I'd like to thank ISPI for hosting us, albeit virtually and hopefully physically soon. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. And I think these discussions will always contribute to the progress of the region. And we hope some policymakers are listening and taking note. Thank you, Isaac. Thank you, Abdulaziz. Thank you, Al-Anud. Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you, Dean, and have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Shukran. Merci
Thank you
beaucoup.
so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Salam. Bye.